Hi, this is Congresswoman Maxine from the 43rd District of California. I have been a member of Congress for 25 years, and I currently serve as the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee. Today, I would like to talk to you about a very important issue facing the African American community and an issue at the heart of my work as ranking member of the committee with jurisdiction over the financial sector. I want to talk to you about the racial wealth gap. It's an issue that I've been concerned about for many years, and one on which I'm leading a resolution supported by over 50 members of Congress urging the United States Congress to proactively implement policies to close the gap. The 2008 financial crisis not only exposed weaknesses in our regulatory framework, but it brought to the forefront the widespread disparities that exist in a variety of aspects of life for African American families. Currently, there's a sizable wealth gap in our country between African Americans and other ethnic groups. The median wealth of white households is about 20 times that of black households and 18 times that of Hispanic households. These lopsided wealth ratios are the largest since the government began publishing such data a quarter century ago, and roughly twice the size of the ratios that had prevailed between those three groups for the 2 decades prior to the Great Recession that ended in 2009. Because wealth is such a critical asset, disparities in wealth have significant consequences. Wealth is the difference between what you own and what you owe. It is critical for you and your children to reach the next level. Wealth building is the difference between sending your children to college or not. And as we learned with the recent financial crisis, wealth is the difference between the ability to make your mortgage payments and stay in your home or being forced out of your house and having to live on the streets. So when we talk about the wealth gap and economic equality, we're not just talking about numbers. We're not just talking about not having as much as the other guy. We're talking about pulling families out of poverty, keeping them out of poverty, and ensuring that their children and their grandchildren never fall back into poverty again. This wealth gap not only stifles economic mobility for communities of color, but it is a serious economic threat to the financial health and security of the entire nation. One thing that's important to understand is that this wealth gap isn't accidental. It's not simply the byproduct of globalization or changing technology or a small subset of elite executives suddenly being worth more than the workers they manage. Instead, I believe the wealth gap has been perpetuated and widened precisely because of policy choices made by lawmakers. When the Congress votes to cut Pell Grants and community block grants to pay for tax cuts for millionaires and endless wars, they're making a very clear statement about our national priorities. Government policies are not alone in contributing to the wealth gap. Far too often, the African American communities are victims of ongoing predatory practices in the private sector as well. For example, African Americans pay more interest rates on their car loans simply because of their race. Our community is targeted by fraudulent for-profit colleges that have been found guilty of charging enormously high rates of tuition while failing to provide a quality education and preparing its students with the tools and skills that will qualify them for a good-paying job. And perhaps most alarmingly, we were disproportionately subject to certain subprime mortgages and predatory loans, both of which are recognized as the cause of the housing crisis and led to record-level foreclosures in the African American community. As a result, in just 2 short years during the Great Recession, African Americans lost more than 50% of the hard-earned wealth in our communities. That is why I've pushed for policies to address the wealth gap. This year, I plan to introduce a credit reporting bill that, if implemented, would immediately help African Americans enhance their purchasing power in our economy. Additionally, I've supported legislation like the American Jobs Act, Project Rebuild, and the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which will help facilitate the rehabilitation of foreclosed homes so that we can reinvest in our communities and the people who live in them. I've led legislation to reform the mortgage standards. I've also fought for loan modifications, and I'm a strong believer in principal reduction as a means of not only keeping families in their homes, but giving them the opportunity to build wealth in them. Lastly, I continue to be the strongest supporter of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the only agency that is taking up the fight against predatory and discriminatory payday lenders, car dealers, for-profit colleges, check cashers, non-bank mortgage originators, and debt collectors. As the year progresses, I encourage all of you to think about the racial wealth gap. Think about how it impacts you and your family, and become advocates for policies and programs that support equality, fairness, and opportunities for all. It's only by rebuilding wealth will we rebuild America, and I hope that we can work together on this important goal.